Hello, my name is Josh and I run Cigarette Burns. Thank you all for coming down for House of Walker. And tonight I'm really excited to have the man himself, Pete Walker, and Jonathan Rigby is going to be talking with him, and we'll have some Q&A questions. And then we'll be showing House of Whipcord. Next week we've got, was the final film in the series, is Frightmare, which is going to be on 35mm. So if you enjoy this, you should come along to that, quite obviously. Otherwise, yeah, Jonathan Rigby and Pete Walker.
Right, Pete Walker.
Yeah.
I think we first met, I think it was exactly 10 years ago when we did DVD commentaries for 3 of your films back to back.
We did.
It was quite a marathon.
Long pauses in the commentaries.
Oh, I'm happy to say there weren't any pauses at all. Now, going back even further, going back 40 years, you were, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, you were a sort of bête noire of Wardour Street. You were the king of exploitation. You made those films.
Indeed.
And yet now, here we are in a temple of culture, one of the ultimate temples of culture, and they're running a season of your films. How does that make you feel?
Well, I expected it all to happen, of course. But no, the answer really is that surprised initially. But everything changes. I mean, and probably during our conversation for the next few minutes, I mean, I will constantly be saying, well, things were different back then. And they were. But how do I feel? Well, I mean, surprised in a way, but you never know the way things are going to go. You never know the way time is going to move on. And it's just, you know, when I was making these films, you're right. I was the king of exploitation, you know, and I was making those films. But everybody's making those films now. I mean, if you go and see, I mean, you look at, I mean, Martin Scorsese is making those films with the Wolf of Wall Street. I mean, God, I saw that movie and loved it. But I came out and I felt so envious and so jealous. You know, in my day, constantly looking over your shoulder for the censor was the apart from the unions as well, because that when I was, you know, making films prolifically, the unions controlled the country, and that was somebody. But it was the censor really that you looked over your shoulder at all the time, and what he would allow and what he wouldn't allow. So you know, that's a long answer.
That's a good answer. Of course, this kind of veneration isn't new, because it's a good 15 years since a guy called Steve Chibnall wrote a book about you. And it had a very, very well-chosen title, I thought. It was called Making Mischief.
Yes, which
very much was your modus operandi, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, we started, certainly the movies I did with McGillivray, that's how we started. We started with a blank sheet and we said, how can we rub them up the wrong way? What can we get them at it with? Before we even thought about what we were going to make the film about.
Well, what you tended to make the films about were actually social issues, pressing issues of the time, which was a very unusual thing to do in the horror genre at that time.
Well, that came into it because you needed that to here again, it was about censorship. You needed that for justification.
Yeah.
You know, and it's interesting is that for 20 years, my films were considered to be very left-wing. And then for the next 20 years, they were considered to be terribly right-wing. No, it's true. It's absolutely true. The reviewers that look back now on my films always look at them and say, particularly with this one you're about to see. Oh yes, there's a nasty, you know, right-wing bias on this movie. Well, you judge for yourself. I mean, if you haven't seen it already.
Well, I believe Alfred Shaughnessy, who in part originated the idea, or at least he had a fragment of a script.
I worked on it with Freddie to start with, yeah.
Alfred Shaughnessy, who at the time was riding the crest of the poshest wave possible. He was the script editor on Upstairs, Downstairs.
And he used to write half of them.
Yeah, but he was also moonlighting, writing films for you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But he, I believe, suggested that you make this particular film so that they can't tell which side you're on.
Well, no, that was not referred to this film. I mean,
okay.
That didn't refer to this film. I think I always quoted Freddie because often when I was interviewed, people would say, are you right or are you left? Were you making these? How were you making these movies? What was your bias? And I would say, well, Freddie always told me, that was because he was an elder statesman, really. Old Pinewood man, and he said, never let them know what side you're on. Never let them know what side you're on.
You had a theatrical background.
Uh-huh.
Your father was a famous comedian, musical comedian, and your mother was a Gaiety girl.
Uh-huh.
How do you think that affected your subsequent career?
Well, from a very early age, in those days, I thought it was my birthright to be in show business. That's what I did. I came to London at the age of 15, 2 pairs of dirty socks, a comic, and 24 shillings, and started out as a stand-up comic. And it was the sort of the last days of variety theatres. Really, they were closing down like. Every town had a variety theatre, and they were just closing down because television was starting to come in. Commercial television was just starting, and so and instead of the normal variety shows, they used to put in kind of American-style burlesque shows with girls. Here again, they couldn't move; they stood at the back of the stage, starkers. And these were the kind of shows I was in. And I suppose that influenced my career, in a way.
You can be spotted in small parts in some second features in the early 60s. Playing croupiers and things like that.
Playing croupiers with pictures, films directed by Lance Comfort.
Oh, yes.
Wonderful old Lance.
That'll mean
Comfort.
a lot to people from the BFI here.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. I did. And Michael Winner. I worked in his early films he never admitted making.
Yes.
Mind you, he shouldn't have admitted making half of them.
Now, as a filmmaker, you first made an impact making sex films. In fact, I think School for Sex was quite a blockbuster.
It was huge, yes,
Yeah.
just on the title and the poster.
Yeah. And, of course, in this particular season, we've seen another of those films where you used exploitation and yet mixed it with what we might loftily call social realism. Cool It Carol.
Cool It Carol, yeah.
With Robin
like
Asquith.
That. Yes, that came off, I thought. All those kind of films, all exploitation films now, are a little dated. I think you have to look at them in the way that they were made for that period. You have to, you can't look at them and judge them against today's movies.
An interesting thing happened, though. In 1972, you made one of the classic exploitation titles. You made a film called The Four Dimensions of Greta.
Yes, yeah.
But the same year, you decided to move into what you prefer to call terror films, and you made a film in your native Brighton, I think, called The Flesh and Blood Show. Now, what made you make that move from sex films to terror films?
Boredom, really. I mean, there was a limit to what you could do when you were making sexploitation films. I mean, for one thing, you were limited by, again, I bring up censorship. You were limited by that, and also, it's really very boring. I mean, sex to watch is boring, isn't it? It's wonderful to participate in, but not to watch is awful. And there was no job satisfaction, honestly, in making those kind of movies. I mean, it was fine, I suppose, if you were making comedies, but even then, we had this censor called Trevelyan. I will not have humour and nudity together. I would get letters from him all this sort of stuff. I mean, it was very, very difficult to construct anything, and one would end up with School for Sex, which was a title and a poster, and a film with a lot of girls in it, where you tried to get as much nudity in as you possibly could, but weren't able to because Trevelyan censors were cutting it all out. So that's what made me move.
But of course, moving into terror films, you of course, had to face up to the censor again on a different level, didn't you? For gruesomeness and all the rest, because your films were unprecedentedly gruesome for the time.
Well, they didn't like it when you mixed sex and violence, of course. But so you constantly got criticism everywhere from all quarters.
The film we're about to watch this afternoon, you made in June 1973. I think it came out the following April, to howls of horror from various sections of the press.
Actually, it got mixed reviews. It got quite good reviews.
Oh, sure, but there was a certain section.
But they condemned its content, but not the.
Oh, they were aware that.
Politics.
Yes, absolutely. Although. Films and Filming, I hope this doesn't disappoint too many people this afternoon, pointed out that students of Fladge will unfortunately be disappointed. So, presumably they felt that your old role as a sex filmmaker hadn't carried over far enough into this wonderful exploitative title, House of Whipcord.
I remember that review, and it was just one specific review. But I think Alexander Walker, for example, was disgusted with the film.
But those are like gold dust, those reviews, aren't they?
Of course.
Was it Frightmare, the film that came after this, where you literally put up a huge litany of this film is appalling and shocking and you shouldn't go and see it on the poster?
Use the word appalling. Appalling.
A moral outrage.
Exactly. Yes, you could use words like immoral and things like that. You wouldn't call it appalling.
It isn't appalling, as you'll find out. However, Trevelyan was replaced by Stephen Murphy,
who was a nice guy and was easy to deal with. Yeah,
and he spotted what I'm sure you won't give a definitive answer to this because you must keep people guessing. But he spotted that the elderly judge and has this gone off? The elderly judge? No, it hasn't. The elderly judge and Mrs. Wakehurst in this film. He felt they were analogous to Lord Longford and Mary Whitehouse because you were making your own critique of the Festival of Light.
Well, I won't say there was a slight influence, but only minute. But he saw it that way, and because of that, he passed a lot of stuff he wouldn't otherwise have passed.
I believe he only asked you to cut one whiplash.
Yeah, in the end, I mean, there was a lot of arguments going on, but I mean, in the end, that's what we settled for. Yes.
The name Margaret Wakehurst does sound awfully like Mary Whitehouse.
Well, of course, in the ensuing years, they said, "Oh, it sounds like our wonderful Prime Minister."
Yes, of course.
But of course, she was a very glamorous. I think, shadow education minister
at the time. Yes, yeah.
But yes, she did. She was a bit, not really. Mary Whitehouse was very kind of librarian, wasn't she? I mean, she wasn't like the character that you're about to see.
Well, that's true. You are quoted anyway as saying that she was modelled on all the Isha ladies you knew because you lived in Isha at the time. Didn't
well, that's right. I didn't say that. I think that was somebody who interviewed me and said these are just like the Isha ladies. I suppose I might have brought it up that they were, but.
Well, the Monthly Film Bulletin followed the Stephen Murphy line. They said House of Whipcord charts the dark side of the Festival of Light with a pop Freud vengeance. And they went on to say, extraordinary, of course, to find such emphases in an essentially commercial exploitation movie. They were quite startled by the content. The fact that they could read this stuff into it, whether they were right or wrong, was surprising from a film coming from, well, you, frankly, coming from the exploitative side of Wardour Street, as they saw it.
Well, and terrific that they did read that into it. I mean, I wasn't going to argue.
Now, I'm very fond of a play called Women of Twilight.
Yes.
In fact, for my sins, I recently directed the first revival of that play in 50 years or more, and it went down a bomb, I'm glad to say. But I believe you were somewhat influenced by it when making House of Whipcord.
Oh, She wouldn't use that word influence.
Oh.
Everybody says this about directors. Oh, one director is influenced by another director, and directors aren't influenced by other directors, and you're not really influenced by anything. Somehow or other, though, yes, there were. I mean, I remember Women of Twilight. I remember it well. In fact, the reason I cast one of the wardresses in this movie is because she was in the original Women of Twilight with Rennie Ray and Frida Jackson. But there are certain similarities between Women of Twilight and this movie.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea really with House of Whipcord was to make. I started off with the idea of making a woman's prison picture. And I went to Freddie, who I was working a lot with at that time, and we dreamed this thing up. He had a little booklet of a Victorian prison governess called Margaret Wakehurst, who had been fired for brutality in about 1885 or something, and this was her story of how she wanted to get her prison back again because this was her life, and so I suppose it spread out from there like a stain. The idea of House of Whipcord, making it in fact a private prison. I don't want to spoil the story if people haven't seen it.
No, absolutely. In case people haven't a clue what I'm talking about, Women of Twilight is set in a home for unmarried mothers run by an extremely nasty landlady who kills people, well, babies anyway. Yeah. And so there are certain similarities, given that this is set in a women's prison with a very nasty woman running it.
There is a similarity, but there's no original story. It's like the Joe Miller joke book, isn't it?
No, we can't interview you, Pete, without talking about Sheila Keith, who was your discovery.
Yes.
And in this film, she plays the most sadistic of the wardresses. The woman who is in Women of Twilight is the sort of secondary wardress, the first one we see, but the really scary one is Sheila Keith. And she's playing a wardress called Walker. Was that an in-joke?
Yeah.
I guess it had to be, really.
That was an in-joke between Freddie and I, actually, that started. He said, I said, we've got to have some real evil character. He said, well, you always have fun naming the characters. I mean, the character we talked about earlier, Dorothy Gordon, who was in Women of Twilight, the original film, and who's in this film. We called her Bates, and everybody has got a Bates in their film. I mean, I don't know why it's a popular name, isn't it?
Right.
So we had a Bates.
Very popular with Hitchcock, of course.
Very hot.
Oh, yeah.
Very popular with Hitchcock. Yeah. Now, where sorry,
we were talking about Walker.
We were talking.
Sheila
about
Keith
Walker.
is what we're really talking about.
We're talking about Sheila Keith and the character Walker. Yes,
Yeah.
But I said, this woman is absolutely unpleasant, totally unsympathetic. What should we call her? And Freddie said, why don't we call her Walker?
That was a backhanded compliment. But Sheila Keith, up to that point, was famous for appearing in the West End with Ginger Rogers in Mame and for playing Lady Justices of the Peace on television.
And doing comedy with Arthur Lowe.
Yes, comedy with Arthur Lowe.
Stooge for Arthur Lowe.
You spotted her potential for terror films, as it were. And she's a very, very scary in your films.
Yes, she is. I mean, I don't know whether you've noticed this, but comedy actors, and she did a lot of comedy, Sheila, comedy actors always make great villains. They, if you go back over comedians, for example, I mean, Bob Monkhouse was a terrific villain. There was a guy called Alfred Marks years ago. If the older people remember Alfred Marks, yeah, I mean, was a great villain. Max Wall played a great villain. I
think Jimmy Jewell probably did as well at some point.
Yeah, probably. I don't remember anything specific with him.
Shall we quickly talk about the films you made after this one?
Mm-hmm.
Because by 1974 you were making a film called Frightmare, again working with David McGillivray.
Yeah.
He, at any rate, was influenced by the Andes air crash in thinking up the topic of cannibalism as your next.
Exactly. Let's start with this one. David McGillivray actually wrote this as well. What happened was, I'd done the story breakdown and the whole story with Freddie, and I think we'd done about 20 pages of the script, working together on it. Then Freddie suddenly called me and said, "Oh, panic! They're bringing forward the new series of Upstairs, Downstairs. I've got to start next week, and they need 3 episodes by, Tuesday week or something, and I've got to get it. So David came in and did a terrific job in about 2 weeks. He'd got the story and he'd got the breakdown. It's always essential when you're making low-budget pictures to have your script broken down into scenes. Otherwise, if you just let a writer have carte blanche, they're going to write huge crowd scenes and have locations in the Bahamas and all that sort of stuff. So you have to, limit it. But David came in and did a terrific job. So this was the first film he worked with me on, and I was very pleased with him. Now then, we're going to Frightmare. Frightmare, when House of Whipcord came out, and it opened at the London Pavilion, which was quite a big theatre, 2,000-seater theatre on Piccadilly Circus, and did the best take for 2 years. Just on the title. The front of house display was amazing. I had Sheila Keith standing there with a whip, and it was fantastic. It took, in those days, and you've got to remember, seat prices were 35 pence, 45 pence, and 65 pence in the gallery, or in the balcony, should I say. Well, they were. That was the price. That was the seat prices. It took 13,500 on its first week, which was very, very good. 48,000 on its 4-week run, which was an excellent take. But what happened then with Frightmare? Why am I wandering off like this? It's age, isn't it? When we came to do the second movie, Frightmare, we started with a completely blank sheet of paper. And we were going to meet on the Monday to discuss the film we were going to make. And I got a call from David on the Saturday, just as I was going out to a football match, and he said, something to think on over the weekend, cannibalism. And I said, but David, this isn't very sexy. In those days, you wanted sex in it as well. Obviously, I said, but there's no sex in cannibalism. He said, well, I think it'll rub them all up the wrong way. And I said, yeah, okay. Anyway, when we did meet on the Monday, we started tossing it around, sort of. I suggested, I think, a female cannibal. And then we always used to end up in sort of schoolboy laughter at the end of anything tossing around a story. It's amazing that we actually got a script out, but we did. But anyway, that's the answer to how Frightmare started.
Well, I suppose if we're talking about the sort of themes that critics responded to in these films, and already in 1975 you're quoted as saying that you've earned the support of several young trendies within the British Film Institute.
Yes.
The theme that they picked up on in House of Whipcord was a sort of satire on moral rearmament, if you like to call it that. And in Frightmare it was care in the community schemes, as it later came to be called, because it was about letting people out of mental homes
there was
too
a lot
soon.
of that happening. Yeah, there was a lot of that happening at that time.
But for the next one, House of Mortal Sin, which is one of my favourites actually, you moved on to nothing less than the Catholic Church.
Yes.
And yet, the huge amount of controversy you thought it would stir up, having a homicidal, sexually repressed Catholic priest murdering people with rosaries and censers and what have you, didn't entirely materialise, I believe.
No, but I had a Catholic school upbringing. I went to Catholic boarding schools, and I just, here again, it's. I know David has always said, oh, Walker came to me with a book about a mad vicar or something, and it's not just that's a lot of hooey. It wasn't. I wanted to make a film about a.
He told that story a couple of weeks ago, right here, actually, yes, about the book about the mad vicar, yeah.
Did he?
Yeah.
Oh, well, he's got to get that out of his mind. It wasn't like that at all. I mean, I here again, we started with a blank sheet of paper, and I said right. Instead, he'd come up with cannibalism, and this time the one line that we used as a coat hanger to hang our coats on, and I said, look, I want to make a film about a sex mad priest. you know. And you know, I went back to my days at boarding school when once a month before benediction, you know, the Catholic priest, Father Eric, I remember, used to they used to have girls from the convent, senior girls, they used to come in for confession before benediction, and Slugmore, my mate, and I used to hide behind the confession and hear him listening to. Talking to these sort of 16, 17-year-old girls that were sort of going in for confession. These terrible things we used to do. And he'd be in there. Now, my dear, tell me about these wicked dreams you're having. You know, I mean,
Well, you've got a scene exactly like that in the film, haven't you?
we do indeed.
Yeah.
That's exactly.
Of course, we've learnt a great deal more about Catholic priests in the last 40 years, so the film seems relatively tame now.
Exactly. But it wasn't then.